Murdock's Music Minute. My Getting Into series continues today with a dash of purple because I'm going to talk about Prince and 5 albums that could be useful to get into his studio discography. It's quite a huge discography. So, this is going to be around the discography of Prince in 80 days. Well, actually, I hope it's going to be less than 80 minutes. As always in this series, I've picked 5 albums for beginners, for starters with Prince. 5 albums that I think hopefully could represent an essential start, an essential way to get into his music, and 5 albums that also show different essential parts of his career. Prince, also known as the artist, aka the artist formerly known as Prince, aka love symbol, etc., etc. Real birth name Prince Rogers Nelson. Grown up in Minneapolis as the son of 2 jazz musicians. Not the easiest family history, not the easiest childhood. His parents split up. He had a difficult relationship or an ambivalent relationship with his father. He then later had a stepbrother, which also wasn't the easiest relationship, etc., etc. But coming from a musical family, it's maybe not too surprising, but still absolutely flooring how much talent Prince brought into pop music. Not only did he write his own songs, he was a multi-instrumentalist. And he produced, I think, basically all of his albums himself. So he really was a one-man army when it came to his music. An oftentimes adventurous artist who was as versatile as he was eccentric. Prince's music is hard to categorize. His roots definitely were in funk and soul music, and those genres are always present in his music, but you also find elements of rock, jazz, and later on also hip-hop and a bit of electronica in his music. Prince probably is usually considered a big star of the 80s and maybe also of the early 90s. So for my 5 getting into albums, I could have easily chosen practically all the albums, well, every album he did in the 1980s, but that would have made it a bit too easy for myself and also would be maybe a little bit uninspired or boring. So I really tried not to only focus on his classic albums from the 80s for my 5 picks, but of course, a couple of those albums will feature in my list. And as always, also the rule is not to include double albums, since I think they are simply too much to be good recommendations for newbies. So let's start with my pick number 1. Prince's recording career started when he was still very young. I think around the time that he was 19 or 20 maybe, he released his first album. His first 2 albums still date back from the late 70s, and they are very much funky disco pop albums. They're not talked about that much usually when it comes to Prince. Maybe they are seen as, Prince's first steps, a young artist who still tries to find his identity, though I have to say, at least on his second album, which is, I think, simply called Prince, things slowly start to get cooking, and they really get cooking by his third album, Dirty Mind from 1980, which is my pick number one in this chronological list of getting into albums. Prince early on liked to play with a controversial image, explicit lyrics, and a certain androgynous appearance. And this album has got it all, or actually, for the first time, really establishes all these ingredients. Dirty Mind, the title track, is a first or an early minimalist hit for Prince. The entire album is notorious for its explicit lyrics, most of all the two tracks Head and Sister. But if you can get past the lyrical content, this is a great, fun party album. When You Were Mine, Do It All Night Long, all these tracks are punchy 80s electro funk, and most of all Uptown and Party Up demonstrate how great a funk player Prince actually was. There's almost a bit of a dirty and rough, low-budget feel to the overall sound of this album, and Prince basically plays all the instruments himself, with the exception of a few background vocals and a little bit of keyboards. This is the first Prince album that really made the world note this artist, and it's maybe one of the coolest things he's ever released. With Dirty Mind, Prince created his very own style of music, and it shouldn't take long until he became a major hitmaker of the decade. Starting all with the song and album 1999 from 1982, but my second selection for the Getting Into list is the most iconic album he ever released, an album without which viewers rightfully would stop this video now, and that is, of course, Purple Rain from 1984. An album that also was the soundtrack to a film with the same name, also starring Prince. A film about, well, a young man who wants to make it in the music industry, maybe also with a bit of autobiographical traces. It shouldn't be the only film by Prince, but it's actually the only film worth watching with Prince, even though also Purple Rain as a movie is a little bit dodgy here and there. The album, however, is a pop masterpiece, one of the most iconic albums of the 80s, and with this one, Prince managed to cater to various audiences at the same time. There's funk, there's soul and R&B, but there's also pop and rock elements, and that made this album a huge hit with practically everybody who was interested in pop music back in 1984. After the very minimalist style of albums like Dirty Mind and Controversy, Purple Rain was more layered and had a band sound, also because Prince started to record more and more with his actual band, The Revolution. The band members brought in their own contributions during the recording sessions, and maybe that's also why you can find the Uber ballad Purple Rain on this album, as well as the party funk pop of Let's Go Crazy and the ultra cool new wave pop of When Doves Cry, Prince's first number one hit. The catchy I Would Die For You was another hit for Prince, but then there's also material like the rather bizarre Darling Nikki, which dives more into the darker aspects of Prince's lyricism. What makes Purple Rain also interesting is that actually three of the tracks were recorded live in Minneapolis, of course, later on with a few added overdubs. But this was a bold, adventurous record. It shows Prince and his band at the top of their game, at the top of their creative process, and it was the last step for Prince on his way to becoming an absolute superstar. This was followed by a phase of massive success and hit singles for Prince that lasted more or less throughout the rest of the 80s, but of course, some of his most famous hits come from the mid 80s, such as Kiss, Raspberry Beret, or Sign of the Times. His albums always switched between a kind of 80s psychedelic pop, funk music, and jazzy soul music. And my third choice is an album that once more showed what a powerhouse Prince and the Revolution were together as a kind of collaborative unity. In 1987, Prince worked on an album that he announced as the Black Album, but then briefly before its actual release date withdrew it from the market, saying that that album was somehow too negative and that it had a kind of evil and destructive energy about it, and instead he replaced it with the quickly recorded Love Sexy, which is my number 3 for getting into Prince albums. It came out in 1988 and was by Prince at least described as a bit of a gospel influenced album about the fight between good and evil. It again blends R&B, funk, rock and pop elements into that very specific Prince 1980s sound, and has one of his most fun singles, Alphabet Street. The other tracks lean more towards a, as mentioned, soul and funk sound. Of course, there's also again a bit of explicit content, as is the case with almost every Prince album. So don't expect Prince to all of a sudden go fully spiritual with Love Sexy. Dance On, for example, is a proper party funk track that already also shows how a bit of a hip hop style and club culture crept into the music of Prince. The title track is another very fine Prince pop rock song. When Two Are in Love is a quite tender ballad, and I Wish You Heaven has a really sweet hook line, but also a bit of rock guitar in the background. So, interesting mixture, and therefore, I think a good example of all the elements that come together in the music of Prince. Love Sexy from 1988. Prince closed out the decade also quite successfully with the famous Batman soundtrack, the soundtrack for the Tim Burton adaptation of Batman. Then he dissolved his backing band, The Revolution, and created or brought together a new band, the so-called New Power Generation, which should be his backing band for actually most of the 1990s. And his first album with this new backing band, or the first album where the New Power Generation, I think, was even mentioned in the credits as, you know, Prince and the New Power Generation, was his 13th studio album and my pick number 4, 1991's Diamonds and Pearls. This album actually doesn't do anything particularly new, or it doesn't change very much in the Prince formula. Again, you have a mix of sometimes rather aggressive funk music, some soul R&B ballads, and some pop rock material. But the 80s keyboards, which were, I think, such a vital part in the sound of Prince during the 80s are absent here. So you already hear from the very beginning of this album that we are now in the 1990s. Diamonds and Pearls, the title track, is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful Prince singles. The other smooth, laid-back radio hit was the more R&B influenced Money Don't Matter Tonight. Willing and Able deploys a bit of a Latin groove. You get the funky daddy pop and Get Off. And the hit single Cream actually was Prince's version of a pretty straightforward, almost a little bit bluesy rock track. So that was number 4. There's one more slot left on my list, and I've tried to find an album to represent Prince's later career for this final pick. He had several other hits in the 90s, especially his album The Gold Experience, I think, was another commercial success, and, well, maybe rather his last commercial success for a longer time, because after that, Prince's career becomes a little bit erratic, to say the least. He went into open conflict with the record industry, with his label. For a while, he refused to put out music under the name of Prince. He put out relatively experimental outlier records. There are some instrumental jazz records. For a while, he used a symbol instead of his name. Continued to release albums in a more funk style, also more hip-hop influences, but somehow the hits were missing. And some of these records are really quite strange and rather unsatisfactory. Some of those more experimental records are actually quite interesting, but certainly nothing that I would recommend to somebody who just wants to start with the Prince discography. So let's jump a little bit forward into the 2000s, when Prince, after years of, releasing albums from the wilderness or in the wilderness, all of a sudden returned with singles that were actually also played on the radio. It started with 2004's Musicology, which often, or at least back then, was seen as a kind of a return into the commercial limelight. But the album that I would recommend is the one that followed in 2006, 3121. This album's title refers to Prince's home address, but interestingly, 3121 could also refer to the fact that this was his officially 31st studio album, and it was released on the 21st of March, I think, back in 2006. It was a very big success, his most successful album since the late 80s. And for me, this album sounds a little bit like Prince looking back and taking stock of what made him a successful musician in the first place. You get all the elements once more. There's R&B, there's a bit of hip-hop, there's a lot of funk, but also for the first time in years, he added elements from, his famous 80s pop rock hits into the music, and this makes for a very well-rounded, nicely flowing, and very entertaining, funky soul pop record. Te Amor Corazon surprises with not only a Spanish title, but also a laid-back acoustic and a bit jazzy bossa nova vibe. Black Sweat modernizes Prince's funk sound and was also quite a successful single. And for those longing for the classic Prince of the 80s, look no further than the track Fury, which, well, arguably maybe is a little bit of a rewrite or a variation of 1999, but well, this is a fantastic pop rock song. One of the best songs Prince did after Alphabet Street, basically. And on the final track, Get on the Boat, he even got back his former drummer from The Revolution, Sheila E., who does some tremendous, excellent percussion. So musically, a lot is happening on this album, and Prince sounds rather comfortable, not creating something very new, but well, looking back at his strengths as a commercial artist and coming up with fantastic new material in this vein. Also, you get a lot of his guitar playing on this album. Prince not only was an excellent songwriter, piano player, and performer on stage, but also a very good guitarist. Yes, Prince will always remain one of the big stars in pop and rock music. He, after 3121, released a string of albums up until 2015. Most of those albums are actually quite solid and worthwhile checking out if you are a true Prince fan. Unfortunately, as you probably know, his career ended in 2016 when he died at the age of only 57, probably due to a cocktail of drugs and wrong medication, and also in combination with maybe exhaustion and overworking himself. The full truth maybe will never be known, but unfortunately, he also became one of the many untimely and really sad rock and roll star deaths in 2016, as mentioned. So if you are new to Prince and his discography, this, by the way, is his album Around the World in One Day, an album I haven't mentioned in my list. It's one of his more experimental works from the 80s, I would argue, even though it contains some of his best slightly psychedelic pop rock tracks. So if you are new, however, to his discography, then let me know what you think of this selection. Also, let me know what your selection would be if you are Prince experts. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel. Maybe thank you also for subscribing or sharing one or the other video. Stay tuned. More mischief here to come on Murdock's Music Minute.